rapid fire, and today's game is
Quod Init Exit IIo is a new Commodore 64 game released in August of 2025 by Retream and headed up by Simone Bevilacqua, who will be joining us today, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi everybody, this is Simone Bevilacqua from somewhere in the middle south of Italy. I'm the developer of Quod Init Exit IIo. Secundus Optimus stands for the Fat Second, that is, the big sequel.
Just like briefly mentioned, this is the third quad game where you play the cute little pig Zampo, which started way back on the C64 in 2012 with the single screen romp Quod Init Exit, which was also published in physical cartridge form at the time by RGCD. This was followed by the 2016 sequel Secundus Minimus, which took the game in a small way to the action platformer style, and eventually to this 2025 full 5-level unconventional platformer subtitled Secundus Optimus, which, like Simone said, means big fat sequel. The story is pretty funny and told through a hilarious back and forth dialogue scene where you, Zampo the pig, find out that all the toilets on your planet were stolen by the aliens known as the Evil Masters and turned into mini potties and spread throughout the world, thus bringing on the chaos. You must travel through the 5 zones from the factory, the towers, fun park, the cliffs, and finally the fortress to retrieve all the potties and take them to the witch Cottacina so she can return them all back to their original state and place. I first wanted to ask Simone about his company Retream and some of the games he's released.
Retream is the label I stick on my productions. It comes from the fusion of retro and dream, as what I do is basically giving shape to my dreams on Commodore 64 and Amiga. But in the past, I made also a few retro style games for Amiga OS4 and PC.
And now a quick word from today's sponsor. The Nova 2 Lite is GameSir's latest wired and wireless controller with the new mechanical circular D-pad, a perfect fit for versus games, Hall effect analog triggers with switches for long and short presses, extra back buttons for customization, and is also compatible with previous GameSir recharge stations. Works with PC, Switch, iOS and Android, and comes in this cool protection case when taking it over to a friend's house. Another extremely affordable controller. And I'll leave links in the video description for purchase. And I thank GameSir again for sponsoring this video. And before we go any deeper into the game, I just wanted to ask Simone to give us some details on the 6 other games that make up the shared universe he created for his releases.
Well, that's just some weird fun. 6 of my games are chained together in a little story that revolves around the so-called Evil Masters, the baddies that first appeared in the Amiga OS4 and PC game Bo. However, the games are totally independent and different from one another. I stopped adding games to the story because every time I added a game, I had to update the manuals of the pre-existing games and release updates, and that was an increasingly demanding task.
Quod Init is essentially a platformer, but a pretty unconventional one as described by the game's manual, as it has platforming action, non-linear stylings, and light puzzle elements. You have to traverse each level looking for the white potties to collect. There are plenty of sparks, traps, and obviously alien bad guys to avoid, all the while food drops all around you to keep up your energy. You can also pick up invincibility and spinach cans, which fill up your turbo fart technique, which can boost you across areas swiftly to solve many puzzles. These can be constantly collected to keep you alive. A lot of the puzzles do involve throwing switches which open new paths in the game's massive 5 levels which you have to explore. There's also alien portals that randomly take you somewhere, and the very useful checkpoints that are all over the place. Get hit or mashed by a trap and you'll instantly be transported to that checkpoint with some lost energy, but also it's actually a device to get you back to certain areas very quickly, and it's also useful to solve puzzles. You have to take a step back and think a little unconventionally when you play this game, as it looks like a simple platformer, which it obviously dishes out, but there's a lot more tricks under the hood. I then asked Simone, after playing his super cool original C64 release Ma, where he comes up with all his original gameplay ideas.
Mostly it's just brainstorming while laying awake in bed. I squeeze my brain to devise something innovative, technically and or from a gameplay point of view. Even if generally it isn't recommendable, often I start from the technical side and then gameplay follows. For example, the skill grade gameplay was designed after I defined a graphical engine. In a few cases, I was inspired by other games, but even then I added my own touch. That's the case of Gemdalus, which was inspired by IIo as well, the second game I've ever tried on my Commodore 64 back in the 80s.
The graphic style to this game is lovely. It uses a ton of high-res sprites and has extremely colorful backdrops, almost like watching a cool C64 scene demo. Everything has a super clean, neat look, which is a graphic style you don't usually see on the C64. I asked Simone if he was inspired by any particular game for Quod's look.
As a kid, I was totally fascinated by the high-res sprites sported by some Commodore 64 games like RoboCop. That became a sort of fixation that pushed me to write a couple of programs to play with colored high-res sprites. I didn't produce anything relevant back then, as I had no tools, no documentation, no help. But about 17 years ago, after many years of Amiga programming, I decided to go back to the machine and to the high-res sprites. Things went a little beyond what I had planned, as I ended up with the first Quod Init Exit, which used high-res not just for my beloved sprites, but also for the background graphics, while keeping a colorful look. The next game I made, Ma, was again centered on high-res sprites. The initial idea was to make a game that exposed how colorful high-res sprites are actually made of multiple sprites. That's why the main phase of the game has those weird single-color sprites. Then, when certain events happen, combine into a single colorful object. The first idea that came to mind was to make a scrolling variant of the first Quod Init Exit, with some gameplay mechanics borrowed from it and some new mechanics that were suitable for a scrolling platformer. As you can see, this is another example of gameplay being affected by technique.
The soundtrack is very subdued and light, also like an early C64 release. It's not in-your-face C64 SID madness, but a cool undertone to the action, and in that way I think it works pretty well, with each level getting its own theme. The levels themselves are very huge, and I asked if the cartridge format was needed to make this game in terms of memory.
The game could theoretically run from disk, but the maps would have to be about 40 pixels shorter, as the loader would need some room in memory. But I never had a floppy drive, so I have no sentimental attachment to floppies. Plus, these days floppies are rare, so I went for the cartridge, which has the added bonus of almost instant loading.
Overall, this game is pretty awesome. It's not super difficult as you receive a constant stream of food and power-ups, but it's still a challenge in terms of platforming and puzzles, so it's a very mid-range challenge for me anyway. The game has a built-in manual, which I highly suggest you read before playing. Simone has also made a whole series of tips and tricks videos for the game that you can check out on his YouTube channel if you get stuck, and I'll leave those links in the video description. With amazing graphics and a huge world, I was curious how long it took one person to make this entire game.
Yeah, I did it all by myself over a period of about 9 years. Actually, it's more like 10 years, because the game builds on top of the predecessor, Quod Init Exit Secundus Minimus, a single level version that fits in 16 kilobytes and that I started in 2015.
And that's it for Secundus Optimus. I'll leave links in the video description to download the game. It's compatible on real hardware, Mini Maxi and VAS, and is PAL format only. And I'll hand it over to Simone for the final words.
Thanks BastHP for having given me this opportunity. I hope you Commodore lovers will enjoy Quod Init Exit IIo. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Bye!